What's going on, everyone? Gareth here with FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today, we're going to be working on this 2011 BMW 135i. So for those of you who are familiar in the world of BMW, you probably already know what these gaskets are on the table in front of us, but for those of you who are unfamiliar, we have our oil filter housing gasket and our oil cooler housing gasket, or oil cooler thermostat gasket in the case of this 135i. These all leak. It's the same design for the N52, N54, N55, N20, N26, and S55 engine. They're all mounted to the cylinder head. And predominantly it's the oil filter housing gasket that leaks, but while you're in there, you should also take care of the oil cooler seal, along with all the associated gaskets and hardware. And that's what we're gonna be doing today on this 135i. With that said, let's talk about some of the tools we're gonna do this job, and then we can go ahead and jump right into it. So some of the tools we're gonna need to replace the oil filter housing gasket and oil cooler gasket on this 135 is pretty much your traditional assortment of BMW tools. 8mm, 10mm, 13mm 6-point socket. We're also going to need 11mm sockets for the intake manifold because that will need to be pulled back a little bit. You will need E10 Torx sockets along with an E10 ratcheting wrench. If you can get your hands on one, that's going to make life much easier, particularly for the bolt in the forward section. You'll see that in a little bit. Extensions, a varying assortment of ratchets. If you have an electric ratchet, that also make life a little bit easier. And then you'll also need a torque wrench that can do upwards of 23 newton meters of torque. Past that, you want the special 86mm 16 flute oil filter housing socket if you have a stock oil filter housing cap on your car. Also, a 7mm hose clamp driver is a nice tool to have, particularly for the fresh air supply tube that goes down to the turbocharger, goes over the top of the valve cover. You'll need to get that out of the way as well. Past that, these are general tools you're going to need. With that said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. One thing you might notice here is this car does not have the windshield cowl or the air filter tray in the back. That's a common modification a lot of people do on these E90 and E80 chassis cars, particularly if you're tuned and you think you're going to be replacing spark plugs a lot. People just tend to leave them off. With that said, up front, we have 4 T20 screws that we need to remove, which I'm going to do right now. This will allow us to take the suction cowl out of the way. From here, we can pull this portion of the suction cowl off and unhook it from the air box and pull it forward. There we go. We'll pop the forward portion of the engine cover off. I think BMW calls it beauty cover. And now from here, we need to get our engine air box out of the way. A couple things to note. We have these cables in the back which hook onto the back side of the airbox, so we need to release those first. And then we have a 6mm hose clamp over here we need to loosen up, and then we'll be able to pull the airbox up and out of the way. So I'm going to start first by making sure nothing is connected to the airbox. It does not appear to be. Well, we have the bracket here, so we'll just pull these cables off. These are the cables I'm talking about. So we have a positive battery cable and some of the engine wiring harness. We'll just slip those up and off. I'll push those off to the side. And now from here we have our mass airflow sensor connector. Just using this little pry bar right here instead of a pick, just pushing up on the release. And then we'll slide it off. And then we have our 6mm hose clamp right here. We're going to loosen. And then from there we can pull our airbox up off the grommets like so and pull it off in one piece. We have some other components here on the engine that we will need to get out of the way. So, we have this additional wiring harness stuff that we'll want to kind of go ahead and pull back. And then we have this cover that goes over the top of the engine that we're also going to go ahead and remove. We need to take this reinforcement brace off for the strut tower. Simply turn this access hole like that. That'll gain us access to a big E-Torx bolt right there. And we're only going to remove this piece here. I'm not going to pull that bolt out entirely, just part of the way out in order to slide this out. The big bolt up top is an E16. And then our bolt here at the strut tower is an E14. The E14 strut tower bolt is going to come out entirely. And then we can just pull it out like that. Now that we have that cross brace out of the way, we can go ahead and remove this plastic cover. This car has an aftermarket intercooler piping. The factory pipe is plastic and very prone to breaking, particularly right here at the throttle body. So if you're doing this job, not a bad idea to have a spare inlet pipe on hand, or it'd also be a great opportunity to upgrade to a metal one that won't break. But this area, very, very fragile on the stock inlet pipes, particularly if it's never been removed before. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna pull this clip up. We're actually gonna remove it entirely. And this inlet pipe is going to come off, no problem whatsoever. We have enough flexibility there because of the silicone couplers, but like I said, if you do have a factory inlet pipe, they've been known to break when you pull them off. So just be prepared for that. And we're gonna remove this upper coupler, which is just a 10mm drive, again, on a stock car that's gonna be slightly different. But the stock charge pipe is 2 pieces, and that'll just allow us to remove the pipe entirely, which is what we need in order to pull our intake manifold back. We also have another connector here that we need to undo. This is the T-map sensor. So at this point, we have enough room here and flexibility to start loosening up and removing all of the intake manifold hardware. It's all 11mm nuts, with the exception of our forward one here, which is a bolt, but 11mm drive still. So we're gonna go ahead and just remove these entirely. We do have another bolt, actually 2 bolts. So in this case, it's 2 bolts and 5 nuts. The vacuum line that comes over to the vacuum reservoir on our valve cover is directly in the way, which is awesome. So this is one of those quick disconnect style couplers. We need to squeeze the locking tabs, kind of rotate it, and then pull it up. These things are pretty failure prone, and they don't like to be messed with too much. So be very careful removing that connector. I like to use these hose pliers to squeeze the tabs, particularly when they're in tight spaces like this. If your N55 has a pneumatic wastegate, it is going to have this vacuum line. If it's an electronic wastegate, it will not have that vacuum line. So pneumatic versus electronic, just one extra thing to disconnect. And from there, we have enough flexibility in that line to remove the bolt. Moment of truth, we should be able to pull the intake manifold back and off the cylinder head. And that gives us just enough space to be able to get to that back bolt. All of that is just to gain enough access to get to that last oil filter housing bolt. Then our next step, we're gonna go ahead and disconnect our oil pressure sensor here. The release mechanism is conveniently upside down. All you're doing is just pressing down on that little tab. Next step, you'll notice our upper radiator hose goes through the oil filter housing, and that's because the oil filter housing acts as a passage for coolant to flow out of the cylinder head back to the radiator. So therefore, before you ever remove this hose, you want to make sure that you drain the cooling system. That's going to be our next step. I'm going to raise the car up in the air and drain coolant from the radiator. And in order to do that, it helps if your expansion tank cap is loose, which I'm going to go ahead and do right now. Not going to remove it, just going to loosen it. And I think it goes without saying, make sure that the car is cool before you ever touch that cap. The pressure release will cause coolant to go everywhere and you will burn yourself. So be careful when you're dealing with that. So we have the car back up in the air. We need to remove this splash shield from underneath the car. Clearly this is an aftermarket aluminum splash shield. Your factory plastic one can be held in with 8mm self-tapping screws pretty much exclusively. You might come across the odd 10mm. This is held in with 4mm Allens because of the fact it's aftermarket. It goes without saying that metal is heavier than plastic, so for the last handful of screws, make sure you have a good firm grip on it. The same would also go for the plastic under tray too. You don't want that coming down on you. Go ahead and we're going to drain from the transcooler. This hose that comes down is going to be the lowest point in the system. It's also connected to this transfer pipe, which is on top of the subframe. So I'm going to go ahead and release this. So that is the path of least resistance. And then it's going to drain pretty rapidly, so just be prepared. Next up, we do want to drain some oil from the oil filter housing. So to do that, we're going to take the oil filter housing cover off. 86 millimeter 16 flute is the socket size for that, or wrench size. Now that I've released that, some of the oil will drain back, but we're going to have to siphon some of it out. So you can see it draining out right now. But again, because the oil filter housing is angled, that center hole is the drain. So we still need to get more of that oil out. Another phenomenon that is sometimes not talked about on this design of this oil filter housing, like I said, we have coolant that travels through it, and then you have oil passages. It is possible for the oil filter housing gasket to be so degraded that it allows coolant and oil to mix in the oil filter housing. So if you see a little bit of oil mixture, like oil floating in the coolant, that could be due to the oil filter housing gasket failing, not a head gasket. If you have a head gasket failure and coolant is mixing by the oil in coolant passages, and you have milkshake, that's more than likely a bad head gasket, or possibly cracked cylinder head or a cracked engine block. But a little bit of oil, it is possible for that oil filter housing gasket to have been the culprit for that as well. So on this N55, it has an oil cooler thermostat with an external air to oil intercooler, or oil to air cooler. Some of these N55s simply have an oil to water cooler on the front, or heat exchanger on the front. In this case, we have oil cooler lines that have to come off. There is a 13 millimeter drive bolt that needs to be removed in order to get the oil cooler lines off. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. And then we should just be able to pull these off. I'm gonna put a towel underneath in case any oil drips out. I'm sure there will. We're gonna go ahead and leave our oil cooler lines up here, up high. And the thermostat's gonna keep dripping until we actually get it out of the way. So I'm just gonna leave a shop towel there to soak up any of the mess. Next up, I'm gonna go ahead and remove our upper radiator hose. This, of course, has the quick disconnect couplings that BMW is really known for. They're both a great invention and a horrible invention simultaneously. You know that the O-ring is still good because this hose is very difficult to remove. It is the O-ring inside the quick disconnect coupling that seals. I'm going to start removing our oil filter housing bolts using a 1/4 inch drive E10 swivel. We do sell one of these at FCP Euro specifically for this job. We can slide in between the intake manifold and the oil filter housing, and we're going to break the bolt loose. And then lastly, we have an E10 bolt down here in this wonderful area between the Mickey Mouse coolant flange and this thermostat hose. So an E10 ratcheting wrench is super useful for that. You could get away with an 8 millimeter drive 12-point wrench, but be very careful because if you round off the head of that E-Torx drive bolt, you're screwed. There's no other way to put that. So I have the ratcheting wrench, the E10, and even with the fan shroud in, we can still get at it. We're gonna go ahead and break that free. Here we go. Oil filter housing with the oil cooler thermostat, and then if you look over here, you could see clear signs that this has probably been leaking for a little while. Not terrible. And then we were talking about earlier in terms of the ability for coolant and oil to mix. That's an oil passage right there, and there's your coolant there. So if you were to have a breach in this seal here, which is just a rubber seal, you could have coolant and oil mixing through that passage right there. Yeah, I don't think there's any mystery that this had been leaking for a period of time. In fact, one of the oil cooler thermostat bolts has so much debris caked around it. Because what happens is, like, the dust and stuff will adhere to the oil, and then it kind of makes this nasty, like, you know, we could dig all that out. I mean, it takes a while for this much buildup to occur. So it's probably been seeping for a minute. And like I said, it makes sense to replace the oil cooler seal at the same time. Because, I mean, when you have that much buildup there, how could you ever tell where that leak is coming from? We'll spend some time cleaning this up, getting the rest of the debris off, but in the meantime, we'll remove these bolts that holds the oil cooler thermostat in place. It's an E12. This is the oil cooler thermostat, so I'm going to put that off to the side there. And then here is the oil cooler seal, which I can tell you does appear to be original. It's definitely original. It's not super brittle, but it's definitely dried out. Still some flexibility to it. And our oil filter housing gasket. Starting to dry out in a couple spots, but still relatively pliable. When these are super bad, they'll break as you pull them out. At this point, I'm just going to spend a little bit of time cleaning both the cooler and the oil filter housing with some brake parts cleaner, some rags, make it look respectable. Point being, when we put it back on the car, if there ever was a leak in the future, you'll be able to pinpoint it, as opposed to you have all this buildup and it's hard to tell whether it's leaking or not. So the first thing we're going to do after we've cleaned it all off, we're going to install our new oil cooler seal, or oil cooler thermostat seal. That's going to fit on the oil filter housing side. I'm going to drop our oil cooler thermostat into position. What you're going to feel, there's a little alignment dowel right down here on the towards the top. You're going to feel this kind of like lock in place, or at least line up. From there, we'll install our new bolts. These are E12, and they will be torqued to 23 Newton meters. Once this is back on the car, I'll give it the final torque. But that is reinstalled at this point. Now from here, we'll reposition the oil filter housing gasket. This goes against the cylinder head. It can only go in one way, so you don't have to worry about the direction or anything like that. And what I was talking about earlier in terms of coolant oil potentially mixing, it can happen right there. So that's an oil passage through here. That's actually the oil return, and then the coolant passes through here on this side. So not much is separating those two. Also, while we're at it, the oil cooler lines, the seals for those sit in here. So just make sure that those O-rings are not present in here. If you see that one is missing on the line and you haven't checked here and you go to put it on with the new seal and that old seal is still in here, you're going to double gasket it, which will then cause a massive leak. So you want to make sure that the O-rings for those oil cooler lines are not present on the oil cooler thermostat side. So we've gone ahead and cleaned our cylinder head here with the mating surface. You could see these old witness marks of where the gasket used to be. Don't worry about that. You don't need to clean that up. There's no imperfection in the surface or anything like that, so there's no need to touch that. You do not want to use any kind of abrasive or anything to clean this. A little bit of brake parts cleaner on a clean towel, remove any of the residue that was there before. That is all that you need to do. First thing we're going to do, we're going to take the new short bolt and we're going to slide it through the back of the cylinder head here, because that is the first bolt that I choose to get started. We have the new gasket obviously installed, and we're just going to get the bolt started by hand. We're not going to totally tighten it, we're going to get it mostly bottomed out because we do need to get those other bolts started. So the two other bolts that we have this really long one that's going to go up here at the top. And then we have this middle length one, or medium length, that's going to go back here behind the intake manifold. I have not tightened that shorter bolt all the way yet. That was just to kind of get it started. Then get this one that's sort of tucked behind the intake manifold first, get that going. And then now that that's started, I'll drop the long bolt in from the top here, and we'll start tightening these down. Now the one bolt here that you're not going to be able to torque is the one that sits low here. The fact of the matter is there just is no room. So again, 23 Newton meters of torque is what it's supposed to be. It's really not that much. You just really want it to be snug. And that's snug without over tightening it. This ratchet that I'm using, this just E10 ratcheting wrench, I'm going to go ahead and just draw this down until I can't move it anymore by hand. And we're going to call that done. There's no need to absolutely crush these bolts down. You don't want to deform the gasket. You just need to be flat against the cylinder head, and you know, tell you that right there. That's going to be more than enough. I'm going to torque the other two to 23 Newton meters, and then I'm going to torque our oil cooler to 23 Newton meters. Now we have our oil cooler lines right here. One of the O-rings is still attached, so we're just going to pull that off. The other one was previously attached to the oil cooler thermostat itself, so we peeled that away. Plop the new oil cooler O-rings in place. They're the same size for both. And then just fish it back down under, and we'll go ahead and reinstall it back to the oil cooler thermostat. It's a fairly tight fit, but you'll feel it kind of bottom out. And then we have this long 13 millimeter drive bolt. We need to fish back up under. Torque spec for that 13 millimeter drive bolt would also be 23 Newton meters. However, pretty difficult to get a torque wrench on that, so you really just have to feel for it. It's the O-rings that create the seal. The bolt doesn't have to be crazy tight. 1/4 inch ratchet. Once the bolt's bottomed out, you're done. Now we're just going to go ahead and replace the oil pressure switch. I feel that this is just a good practice to do while you're in there. Wouldn't say they're necessarily failure prone, but it's not that much more effort to replace it right now than it would be potentially later. The new oil pressure switch comes with an O-ring. Go ahead and reinstall the oil filter. Torque spec on that cap is 25 Newton meters, but quite frankly, you can pretty much just go hand tight with it, and that is more than enough. Yep. So you can pull the intake manifold pretty far away from the cylinder head, and at this point, we're just going to go ahead and replace the individual intake manifold gaskets. I'm sure plenty of people choose not to do this and save time, but if one of these gaskets was pinched or slightly deformed, you will definitely get some lean codes, and the car will certainly run rough. So we're going to pull these gaskets out, and we're going to go ahead and replace them individually. All right, so at this point, I'm going to go ahead and tighten the intake manifold down. Just going to bottom out the nuts. Final torque will be 15 Newton meters, and they are 11 millimeter. And I'm just starting from the inside, working my way out. So now that the intake manifold is reattached to the cylinder head and resealed, I'm going to go ahead and reconnect our inlet pipe to the throttle body. Obviously, again, this is an aftermarket charge pipe, so the installation procedure is slightly different because it has some flexibility that the factory pipe would not have. Best practice when installing any of these charge pipes, whether aftermarket or factory, is to leave the clamped connections loose first. Get everything aligned up at both the intercooler and the throttle body first. Once the charge pipe is secured on the throttle body and the intercooler, you can then go ahead and tighten all of the clamped connections down afterwards. So don't tighten those first, get everything situated, and then go ahead and tighten everything down. Also, best practice to also install a new O-ring on the charge pipe connection at the throttle body. Those do tend to leak after a while, so it is the best idea to replace them at this point. There we go, that is secure. At this point, we can connect our sensor down here for that click. And again, like I said, I left all these clamped connections loose so I can get the proper orientation on them. And now that everything is lined up the way that it needs to be, I can go ahead and tighten those down. Went ahead and reinstalled the vacuum line for the wastegate actuator boost reservoir. It's only going to be on early production N55s because they eventually moved over to an electronic wastegate, but this has a pneumatic wastegate, so just need to make sure that's plugged back in, which we just did. And then on your automatic transmission cars or dual clutch transmission cars, you need to resecure the trans cooler back to the fan shroud, which is held in with a T25 screw. So now we're gonna go ahead and put the under tray back on. Again, this is an aftermarket tray. And it's just secured with a bunch of 4mm Allens. Your factory trays are gonna be secured with a bunch of 8mm 6 points. So 2 things you need to do before you start the engine. Number 1, make sure that you prime the oiling circuit. We have a full video specifically about the N55 and some of the problems that these engines have had after oil filter housing gasket repairs or other repair work on the lubrication system or circuit. So make sure you prime the engine first, and then the other thing we need to do is refill the cooling system. So I have pre-mixed BMW antifreeze here, so 50-50, and just have a vacuum bleeder right now in the system. So I've evacuated the system of air, making sure that it can hold vacuum first. Now that I've confirmed it can hold vacuum, I know that the system is sealed tightly. I'm gonna go ahead and let this thing fill the system with coolant. This is a cheat way of doing it. We'll also use the automated system that the car has with the electric pump afterwards, but this is a nice way to get the system filled initially. So at this point, we fill the cooling system with coolant and we vacuum bled it. But I'm also going to activate the car's self-bleeding system via electric water pump. We have another video specifically on these engines, how to do that. So I'm going to let it do its thing in the background. That takes about 8 to 10 minutes. And then after that's done, and I know that the cooling system is completely bled out, I'll go ahead and button up the rest of the car. All right, so at this point, we're ready to button up the rest of the engine. We're going to put the covers back on, put the cross brace back in, make sure the wiring is routed correctly and everything, put the air box back in, make sure all the connectors are plugged back in, and yeah, we should be good from this point forward. Next up, we'll stick the air box back in. A bunch of the wiring harness for the engine sits on this back side here, so I just want to make sure that those are re-secured before I go too much further. And then we're going to take a 6mm hose clamp driver or a flathead screwdriver or a 6mm socket, tighten down this hose clamp here. Take our strut brace, make sure it slides under the main mounting bolt here at the back of the cowl. This bolt does have a torque spec at the firewall. However, we did previously mention that bolt had been stripped out previously and we did a thread repair on it. Do not trust that to hold the torque that it needs to be. So we'll tell you what the torque is, but I'm gonna just go ahead and tighten this down by hand to prevent any further damage. And then we have a E14 over here at the strut tower. We'll put the front of the engine cover back on. We'll reinstall the suction cowl here. This is at the front of the airbox. And then we have these 2 pieces here that sit at the front of the crash structure. They're both side specific. And then those are secured with some T25 screws. All right, and that's how you go about replacing your oil filter housing gasket and oil cooler seal on any N55 powered BMW. In the case of this 2011 BMW 135i, we do have the oil cooler thermostat. Some N55s might just have the water or oil to water cooler on the front, which is a slightly different design, so you don't have to worry about oil cooler line seals, but the general overall process is going to be the same no matter what. One thing to keep in mind, again, we did mention it, you do need to prime the oiling circuit after this, just because of some issues N55s have had with engine damage occurring after these types of repairs. So make sure you prime the engine, make sure you bleed the cooling system out with the automated procedure, and you should be pretty fine. Should be pretty fine, LOL. If you follow those 2 things, you'll be fine moving forward. Another thing to note, just make sure that when you put those intake manifold gaskets in place with the procedure we showed you, that they are fully seated, that they're not pinched. You don't want to end up with a vacuum leak after the fact, so just take a little bit of time and make sure everything's good on that front. But we hope you learned something from this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. If you like this video, hit the like button. As always, we have a lot of content on the way, so make sure you hit that subscribe button and notification button so you're notified when we drop those videos. And I'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching. Hey, yo. All right.